right, a very good afternoon to everyone. Our apologies for taking the liberty of taking a 5-minute academic quarter. I would like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on acting fast and thinking long, putting the Green Deal at the center of the Europe's COVID-19 economic recovery, which is jointly hosted by the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Greens in the European Parliament. As you hopefully all are aware of, has the European Commission launched its own plan for an economic recovery to the corona crisis last Wednesday, and it intends to spend up to 750 billion in grants and loans to aid EU member countries in tackling the economic fallout from COVID-19. And much of that money will go to investments, or is planned to go to investments to a lasting economic recovery. It's a fantastic amount of money that we're talking about here, and this webinar today will be about the question if and how this amount of money can accelerate political action and funding into a transition to a more sustainable, resilient, and just Europe. My name is Diederik. I am the head of the EU policy engagement at the Stockholm Environment Institute. For those of you who don't know, SCI is an independent think tank. And the other host, of course, is someone that you know probably much better, is Eickhout, who is a member of the European Parliament, and he's also the vice chair of the Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. In addition to Bas, who will be moderating the panel today, we have 3 distinct panelists. Diederik Samsom, who is the head of cabinet from the Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans being in charge of the Green Deal. We have my colleague Åsa Persson, who is the Research Director and Deputy Director of SCI speaking, and then Sandrine Dixon-Leclerc, who is the co-president of the Club of Rome. The way we will have this webinar today is it's going to be for 1 hour, and after I'm stopped talking, we will hear from Diederik about the European Commission's plan of the COVID-19 recovery. There will be around 10 minutes or so, and then we have first a panel discussion for around 25 minutes, and then we open up to the audience and get some questions in, and then we will end this webinar around in an hour if not concluding remarks from myself. Before I give the word over to Diederik, I just wanted to mention that if you have questions, please post them in the chat on YouTube, and please state your name and organization so we know who we're talking to. It's always much more friendlier if we know who the other person is. Be short and concise with your question, and we will try to put any question to the panel, but we probably not get to everyone. So, okay, so without further ado, Diederik.
Thank you very much, Gregor, and welcome to everyone. Yes, I was asked to briefly introduce, the question of today, the Green Deal at the center of European recovery to you, and I can be very brief about that. We managed to put it in the center of Europe's recovery, at least in our plans. Let me elaborate on that. When we presented the Green Deal 4 months ago or 5 months ago, it seems like an eternity now, in a completely different world, in a completely different context. By then, the European Commission was bold enough to present it as a growth strategy. We received some flack from the environmental movement for that, and I can understand that, because how to present an environmental strategy as a growth strategy, but we were serious about it. Europe needs more than environmental repair and sustainability. Europe also needs a new growth strategy. We are an aging continent, literally, but also if you look at our industry, if you look at the innovation part, we're lagging behind on other parts of the world. And the Green Deal provided an excellent opportunity to change that for the better. That was all before COVID entered our world. And as soon as COVID entered our world, Europe, and actually everybody in Europe, immediately started to think about a recovery strategy, learning from the crisis in 2009 and 2010, when countries, and especially Europe, were a bit delayed in their response. We now wanted to waste no time and could immediately come up with a growth strategy. So we took the growth strategy that was already on the shelves, which is the Green Deal. And obviously the logic is evident. If you want to pick up the pieces after a crash like this, we are amidst of it, but it's already clear that it's going to be one of the biggest economic crashes that we've ever experienced. If you want to recover from that, you want to invest in a thriving economy, you better do it right the first instance. So not build up the old economy and then start sustaining it or making it green, but do that directly. The logic is self-evident, obviously. So we made that plan, but I'm far from complacent, because I do realize that this is just the idea. This is the promise. This is the political will, because I experienced a lot of that political will here, and I'm glad about that. But we are all humans, and if you want to get back into life after this lockdown and after the economic crash, you immediately, your first response would be to drive like you drove, to fly like you flew, and to operate your factory like you operated your factory, to just get back to where you were. So the human reflex and the political reflex, and I think also the business reflex, is one of just picking up the pieces and go along as we were. And that's our real challenge. The plan is just the first step. The real challenge is to make this work, to show to people that this is about a real recovery. And that's also why we didn't just take the Green Deal, but we reshuffled and reprioritized it so to make it to shape it into a real recovery. To give you two examples, one of them is obviously renovation. If we want to create new jobs fast and we want to help people with their energy bills, people that lost a lot of purchasing power during this crisis, what better to do than start renovating homes at a large scale? That was already somewhere hidden in the plans, and we now put it front and center. The other example is more on the policy part, the Just Transition Fund. If you want to make this work, you need to be serious about the justness of the green transition. We knew that before COVID entered our world, but we now know that even more. And if we want to press the Green Deal in fast forward while the economy is in reverse, the gap is only getting bigger. So where we had a Just Transition Fund of 7.5 billion, multiplying that with investment money to about 100, we now increase the 7.5 billion to 40 billion. Not only to show that we're serious, but we are serious. And we're going to spend that money there where it's badly needed, in regions that were already lagging behind, that had already a challenge to catch up towards a sustainable economy. And now, obviously, that challenge only got bigger. So that's only two examples of the design in the Green Deal. I will be happy to answer all other questions about what we did right or wrong and what we can do better, because that's what this webinar is about. But I'm confident that we made the first step forward. I'm a little proud of that too, but I'm not leaning backwards. We are not leaning backwards, because we know the real work is only starting now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diederik, and exactly 10 minutes, I would say. So that's impressive. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bas Eickhout, member of European Parliament, and indeed involved in green issues for a while now, just like many of us all around. Well, not the table, the virtual table here. What we're going to do now is of course, this was the introduction by Diederik Samsom, and I think he already alluded to that there will be questions, because he's absolutely right. The Green Deal is full and center if you read all the documents of the European Commission. But of course, now the big question is, how are we going to proceed, and how are we going to make it happen? And that is still a big step to take there. And I think that is a step we need to take together with the Commission, with the Parliament, but also with the civil society and with the science. And that's exactly what we have around the table here. And so what we're going to do is now first, we're going to listen to our two other speakers who will give their initial reaction to what Diederik said. But I'm also sure they will have made some points already on after having read the plans of the Commission. They had a week for that, so and I know that they can read fast, so I'm sure they have some comments there. And then I'm sure there will be some discussion between our panelists, and then, as Gregor already said, then we will open up also the floor for questions coming from the audience. But I first would like to hear now the experts around the table on how they see the proposal by the Commission and how they feel that the coming discussion will come, because this is only the start of the journey and not the end, as Diederik also said. So I first would like to give the floor to Sandrine, Club of Rome, but many other things. We know each other for a while already, so that's why I feel comfortable to call you Sandrine. I would like to give you the possibility to give an initial reaction to what Diederik said and what the Commission proposed last week.
Thank you, Bas. And first of all, can I commend the European Commission, but also the Parliament, for all of its work that it's done around the thinking around the Green Deal. And yes, this thinking has been going on for quite some time, but really with the leadership of President von der Leyen, I think we're seeing the convergence of this thinking into a real package of directives which are absolutely necessary if we're to look at implementing the SDGs, putting in place a holistic systems approach. It's a start. It's not obviously the complete package yet. And as Diederik says, I think the proof will be in the pudding in terms of implementation in the member states, and in particular in a post-COVID world, the pushback that we might be getting from incumbents and also from those countries that are having a much harder time of shifting towards a low carbon economy, and also an economy which is more respectful of biodiversity. A few reflections in terms of what I'm seeing around me over the last 2 weeks. First of all, having been on a series of international calls, can I just say, Diederik and Bas, that everyone is looking towards the leadership of the European Union in terms of how the Green Deal is anchored into a recovery plan. I think it's incredibly important that we take to heart this leadership position and that we ensure that we are thoughtful, both in terms of bringing people, planet, and prosperity together, because clearly we are in a post-COVID world, which means we have to think about livelihoods of people, but at the same time, make people realize and bring them on the journey that actually by bringing people, planet, and prosperity together, we will be more prosperous. So that leads me actually to your growth scenario, Diederik, because yes, you know, we've always been named as the anti-growth guys in terms of the Club of Rome organization. And I wouldn't say that we are necessarily anti-growth. I think everything lies in the definition of what growth is. We are definitely in a new growth paradigm. We want to think about prosperity. We want to think about natural capital as being fully integrated, as well as externalities, into the way in which we look at growth. We are heartened by the fact that for the first time ever, the Chinese are now rethinking GDP as being the measure of their growth as they move out of COVID. We are heartened by donut economics and the fact that this has now been applied as a much more holistic approach towards a system which looks at people within the planetary boundaries, and this has already been applied in Amsterdam. We're also heartened by Scotland and Iceland and New Zealand and Finland and Denmark and Costa Rica, who are looking at a well-being economy as a much more robust economy as we build resilience post-COVID. And I think the Green Deal already has many different elements of those different well-being economy plans. And if we can start to look at the moving forward, bouncing forward, rather than business as usual scenarios, which truly do prop up an old economy, which was no longer functioning for people, planet, and prosperity. Hence why we have COVID, a zoonotic disease, which demonstrates that mankind has actually, or humankind has encroached on the planetary boundaries. And if we take into consideration the fact that people, and I will conclude with this, in many countries across the globe, apart from maybe the United States, are saying that they do not want to go back into business as usual. We must be brave and bring in place our financial institutions, our governing institutions, to put in place the right frameworks. And in this European context, the Green Deal Plus, which is the way in which the EIB, the ECB, and the national central banks also implement the just transition funds and ensure that actually we can move forward with the financial underbelly that we need to prove that our economy can be much better, much stronger, more resilient in a post-COVID world than the current business as usual economy that we've been dependent on in terms of a high dependency on fossil fuels and high carbon products and services. So I will leave it at that. I think this is the crux of something incredibly exciting. And may I say that all of the business groups that I work with, the advisory boards that I sit on, even a Euroelectric that had actually a panel at the beginning of last week around the recovery, not one company that I've been in a discussion with has indicated that they do not think that the green recovery is the right way forward. So now we need to figure out what that means in practice.
Thanks very much, Sandrine. Clear call there, and also showing out the support that there is in the broad society. Åsa Persson from Stockholm Environment Institute. So the organizer of this, I'm just moderating. The organization is mainly by the Stockholm Environmental Institute, research institute, having been worked on this for a while. So interested to hear your take on what the Commission is working on.
Think you very much, Bas and Diederik and Sandrine, and great to see so many joining today. I just wanted to briefly also acknowledge a think tank network that SEI works with, Think Sustainable Europe. Together we share analysis and join forces to make evidence count in developing European policies. So obviously, reading the news headlines today, the world is not in a healthy state in many ways. But overall, we are still quite positive that this pandemic crisis will not slow down the implementation of the European Green Deal, and at best will accelerate it, having shaken up the status quo in different ways. So I'll try and briefly comment on the scale issue. Will we reach our climate targets with this recovery package? Accountability, justice issues, resilience and leadership. But just wanted to start off also briefly reflecting a little bit. Let us remember back 2-3 months ago, when the pandemic was just hitting Europe widely, it was very uncertain then actually how the climate agenda would land as the economic crisis took off. Stock markets dropped dramatically. People were starting to be let off. The climate COP was up in the air. So the outlook was pretty bleak at the time for ambitious climate cooperation. But now we do have this EU recovery package, and I would definitely agree. It seems that the Green Deal is indeed one of the two guiding objectives, together with the digital agenda. And the stock markets are back up. We have new dates for COP. So although there are massive challenges now, unemployment, economic downturn, ensuring implementation of these climate commitments, ensuring ambitious NDCs from other countries, major emitters, I would say. So what was the turning point in all of this? I think we all have our own analysis of this. Clearly, there's been a strong mobilization among political leaders, business leaders, civil society, and science. For my part, it was seeing a survey of some 100 investors early May, when I think a majority of 75% believed that there would be increased demand after the crisis for environmental and sustainability investments. So having that apparent commitment from the investor community and big capital, I think was reassuring that our climate targets are here to stay. So a few comments then on the sustainability of this recovery package. Will it enable us to achieve our climate targets at the scale needed, at the speed needed? I think this deal definitely passed the first test of not apparently backtracking on our existing norms and targets. The EU's climate targets are sort of increasingly in line with what science calls for. We know that they could be even more ambitious depending on how we consider things like probabilities of sticking to 1.5 and equity. But still, we have not backtracked yet on these targets. But will these new spending plans, investments enable the right scale and speed? Here, I guess I have some questions, and maybe Diederik can comment later. Earmarking 25% of the EU budget is as I understand, an improvement from previous commitments. But still, if we look at the estimated price tag of the green transition in these recovery package documents, 940 billion euro, it seems to me the math doesn't really add up, and there is a shortfall in financing of some hundreds of billions. I guess another big question is what was alluded to, how will this land in member states? What will be the interaction between the EU recovery package and member states' national recovery packages? Who will set the norms? And will member states coordinate also around their national recovery packages and instruments? Third issue is time horizon, the detailed rules of all these instruments. What will be the sort of time horizon we look at? Will important investments be eligible in terms of the return and the payback period considered? But overall, definitely very positive and in the right direction. And I think it's important also from social science, if you do policy science like I do, importance of not just having ambitious policy targets, but also credible ones. So I think there is a balance in this package. Accountability. Here we have, together with our European think tank colleagues, proposed that maybe there's a need for a green recovery scrutiny board modeled on the EU regulatory scrutiny board, because as Diederik alluded to, now there is an ambitious plan now for green recovery. Will it be delivered? We know that from the previous financial crisis, we did fail to some extent to deliver on those high green ambitions. So that's an idea and also a question. How will we scrutinize these proposals going forward in national plans? Is there a need for independent institutions for this purpose? On just transition, again, positive that this is being scaled up. Just want to add what we have found in our research is that the money is one thing, very important, and also the targeting of the most vulnerable communities is very important, but process is also very important. So how will these communities be actively involved, engaged in developing these concrete measures and programs at the local level? Could be very important for political and public support. Resilience, this is a huge topic. We're very glad to see it being featured more strongly, but just picking one aspect here, resilient supply chains. This is something we hear more and more about. We see calls for onshoring production, shortening value chains, localizing production, which can sound good for sustainability, but I think there are really important research questions. So this is also, I think, a call for us in the research community. What is actually the optimal resilience? When do you increase environmental efficiency by repatriating production? When do you actually decrease it? So I think this is far from a simple issue. It's not black and white. It's about finding the right balance on that scale of not being completely self-reliant. That's not very resilient. Not being completely import dependent. Not very resilient either. And of course, this should also be seen in the sustainable development context. What economic development opportunities are our exporting partners potentially missing out on going forward? But a very big question that needs a lot of research. I'll finish off just also commenting on EU leadership that Sandrine mentioned. Very important. Initial research on national recovery packages. It's very speculative. Of course, it's very difficult to kind of evaluate how green they are. But some figures by Nicholas Stern and others concluded that perhaps only 4% were actually green. 92% were neither brown or green, and 4% brown. So I would just reinforce EU has a very important role here. And of course, also in the cooperation with developing countries, where we can expect major crises, more severe inequalities arising, and all kinds of societal problems emerging, and solutions, hopefully. So there, we'd be curious to know if there are more ideas on how this leadership will be performed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I have, of course, the duty to try to limit the discussion a bit, because when we are discussing such an issue, it can, of course, go in many directions, because it is so crucial and so centerpiece in all developments. So I would like to pick up on a couple of things where I think the discussion should focus on a bit more, and then I give Diederik the floor to reply to those. First of all, and I think it's you already mentioned it in your introduction, and Sandrine came back to it. That's of course this growth strategy. And I also see some questions in the chat, and it has been made a couple of points. This is of course also talking about, well, the footprint of Europe. So it's not only talking about the emissions within Europe, but also, of course, the consumption of Europe of total products. And our footprint is usually bigger than what we are producing only in Europe. And to what level is that now also really part of the Green Deal? And are we not only focusing on greening Europe in its production, and meanwhile having a huge footprint broader than only the European Union? I think that is certainly an issue that we should come back to. Secondly, this is about what Sandrine said. Proof of the pudding is in the eating, and this comes very important for the discussion we are going to see about this recovery and resilience facility. I mean, the words are all good, but in the end, the idea is that the Commission will judge recovery plans of countries. And then exactly, it becomes very unclear on what basis is the Commission going to judge those national plans. I mean, in words, it's the semester, it's the national climate and energy plans. But if you look at the semester, potentially that already can be everything. So it's giving a huge, well, you could say in a positive way, flexibility, but it can also be very difficult for the Commission to have a discussion with a member state when they come forward with a recovery plan, and then on what basis are you going to say, no, this should be improved and this is not good enough? Also because very likely other member states might go and back the other member states, and you end up with member states backing each other, and you as Commission there a bit alone in trying then to improve the plans, and the leverage you have might be limited. So I think that's also a bit on how is it going to work in practice. Third question is a bit on what Åsa also said. It's about how does this fit with what the national plans are doing? So we are not talking, of course, about the billions from Europe, but, well, in a most positive way, you can say it's 1,100 MFF and 750 recovery. So that's 1,850. But already in state aid, there's more than 2,000 billion of euros spent by member states. So, and we don't seem to talk about that. So how do we make sure that when we are investing in a green economy and in the Europe recovery, that it's also something that is working in the same direction when the member states are spending their money? And I think the last point is really about this leadership. How, because both Sandrine and Åsa mentioned it, this leadership of Europe. What are the ideas of the Commission to make sure that when Europe is putting this Green Deal central, how are we going to make sure that this leadership of Europe is not only for the European Union, but is also setting an example and also really getting the world moving towards that green economy? Because in the end, we will need that from more countries than just the European Union. I think that's a bit of a selection of items that I got from listening to Sandrine and Åsa. Diederik.
Well, thank you very much. to combine the questions a little, because 1 and 4 are basically combined. And how do we prevent, how do we prevent extending our footprint outside of Europe while pretending to be very sustainable within Europe? Obviously, the Green Deal itself was already elaborating on that. We were obviously planning, we're still planning to work that, to operationalize that further, but the Green Deal was looking beyond the European borders, also in a more, let's say, assertive way than we were used to. So that's also why we put down the commitment that products that enter the European Union should comply with European Union standards, no exception. That is a difficult discussion, as we already saw in the next strategy, the Farm to Fork, which saw the light of day a few weeks ago, where we implemented that commitment for food products, for agricultural products, which is quite a contentious issue, and you can have a lot of bilateral fights with other countries around the world on this. The other part, the other example of our new, let's say, resilience on this, or vigilance, you could say, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism to create a level playing field on a high level. Normally, we create a level playing field in Europe with the rest of the world by lowering our own playing field so that it's level with the others. But now we anticipate to do it the other way around, and we strengthened the carbon border adjustment mechanism by in the recovery package by putting it forward as an essential element of paying back all those loans, making it more attractive or less easy for countries to ignore it. Some countries still would like to ignore this carbon border adjustment mechanism for obvious reasons. Now it's also part of not only the strategy in sustainable sense, but also in financial terms. It's a part of the payback strategy. And this is also how we think we should show leadership in the world. I mean, our traditional diplomacy is still fine, could be strengthened, should be strengthened, but it should also be added with a bit more, as I said, boldness, audacity, and saying, okay, we mean business. We are serious about our sustainable strategy for the future, and we also want to extend that to the rest of the world, if needed, with instruments that we were in the past happy to forget about for obvious reasons, not to create trouble with others in the world. Now we are ready to create some trouble if needed. On the recovery and on how to influence, or how the dynamics with the national plans and the member states are going, which is actually question 2 and 3 for you from your side. It's the let's say I'm a bit reluctant to accept the old-fashioned us against them dichotomy, the separation between us in the European Commission being very committed to a sustainable future, and them, the member states, trying to ignore that as much as they can with their plans and with all kinds of ways to sneak out of their obligations. I think it's the member states and the European Commission are one organism, and we should influence each other, and we have tools to influence and inspire each other. So the semester is one of those tools, but as you rightly said, it's far from perfect. You can do everything and nothing at the same time with the semester, and we need more practice with that. But we don't want to wait until we are done practicing. We also want to inspire in another way, and that's why I'm glad and a little proud that we also put some other instruments into the recovery package, the next generation EU instrument, as we call it ourselves. It's not only money for countries in return for plans that have to be judged, and you can argue whether we have the strength to really judge them and really make them accountable. But we also have another piece of money, it's not nothing, it's no small beer, it's tens of billions of euros that we can invest ourselves directly into companies, into parts of society where sustainability is a promising option for the future that actually deserves those investments, but commercial banks will or cannot do them for obvious reasons after this crisis. InvestEU is our new flagship to promote directly sustainable investments, and we hope with that new instrument that we can also inspire national governments to do the same. I think this is only going to fly if we not try to convince each other with words, but also convince each other with actions. And if we can start that as soon as possible, I'm optimistic that we can convince each other, learn from each other, and obviously use the semester as a guiding tool, but don't need to use it as a stick, because in the end, we don't really have one. As I said, we are one organism and we don't beat each other.
Thank you. Just briefly, reactions from Sandrine or Åsa?
I actually really appreciate Diederik's response, and I tend to agree that exactly as you put in your questions, that the growth paradigm and the link with the footprint is absolutely fundamental. But we all know that border tax adjustment is the final stick, right? And I guess the one thing that was missing from the response, Diederik, and I'm sure it's just a question of time, is we need to figure out in our bilateral trade deals how we can actually best use some diplomacy. And this comes back to actually how do we shift the paradigm outside? Because if we can start to convince other countries to do the same, then we will be less in a quagmire around getting dumped on with regard to high carbon products and products that don't meet our own specifications. So we need to use the stick more also as a forcing mechanism to ensure that other countries actually join. And I would maybe add to that, if you look at the the high ambition coalition countries that are now coming together tomorrow, actually, with an announcement around people and nature. And we will be doing a press briefing ourselves, which I will be on with Teresa Ribera, but other ambitious countries outside of Europe. It's really incredible to see how they're starting to look at what we're doing and replicating that, both in terms of trade deals, but also in terms of how we put nature and decarbonization at the heart of an economic recovery. And I think the more we are able to stimulate those kinds of negotiations and coalitions of countries, the more then also member states in Europe that currently think that this is just the ambitious countries in Europe and it's their plan and not embody it themselves will start to see that actually outside there are also many other countries that are starting to do the same thing. So I think we need to create that approach so that there's a pressure that comes from outside Europe as well on those countries that within Europe for the moment don't really see the light in the same way that some of the more ambitious countries do. And maybe one last point on that. I do think that the missing point on this is still how do we bring people on board? Right now, this is the time, and you're right, Diederik, there should be no separation between member states and the European Union. We should be one. The European Commission should be the engine for some of that thinking. But we need to make sure that we communicate that properly to people so that we don't get continuous rise of populism and that they use, the populists in particular, and those parties, use this as a way to bring down the more progressive thinkers across Europe who feel that a Green Deal is the right way forward.
Thanks, Sandrine. Åsa?
Yes, just a few points to add there. I think in terms of the EU leadership, it will be interesting to see now also, as we know, COP26 is being delayed with a year, to see what other moments there will be for the world community to come together and sort of have this race to the top competition logic, if you like. I've heard Japan has offered to host such a meeting. But also, I'm aware that the UK, as the presidency of COP26, have started a process. Currently, it's going on in the science community on how to define standards for net zero targets. And I think that's also an opportunity where the EU could come in as and this is, I should say, a kind of multi-actor type of process. We have national governments, local governments, businesses, investors, everyone who's now setting some type of net zero target. This is where the EU could come in as that sort of norm setter, again, helping to set a high international standard. But I also wanted to make a few comments on this footprint question. Our research institute, we have been researching footprints, quantifying them for many years. But what struck me now, hearing also this discussion, is that really at this point, perhaps we want to not kind of just minimize the EU footprint, but make it green, because we do want to influence how production is taking place in our exporting partners, to see that it's environmentally efficient and low in carbon. So I think maybe, so that's one idea, should we talk about green footprints instead? But there's a big toolbox really to reduce footprints. One is the economic instruments, the carbon border adjustment. One, a regulatory instrument. I like this idea of sustainability product standards, as I believe discussed in the context of the circular economy action plan. But a third one, information. And here there have been big leaps forward in the traceability of our supply chains. How sustainably is our palm oil produced? Where do we, which locality do we actually get it from to Europe? We have a few such tools at the CI. So this is really transformative transparency that will not only help regulators and government to improve practices, but of course also companies, even consumers. So I think that's actually a nice way of combining the green and the digital transition, having this traceability.
Thanks a lot. Conscious of looking at the time, I am following. Someone was wondering, are you following the chat? Yes, we are following the chat, and I sometimes try to squeeze in some of those questions, and I will do that now also. And I think there are a couple of more general concerns if you read the chat, or at least questions about, and that is, of course, this relation. You already said it, Diederik, this relation between the European Commission, Brussels, and the member states. So one of the questions also in the chat is, how will you make sure that all countries will benefit? And there, of course, you are mainly also thinking of countries like Poland, who are very much reliant still on coal. To what extent is this Green Deal really fitting them? And how is the Commission ensuring that all the countries are being helped and profiting from this? Another question from Idri on how to make sure that the national rescue plans are working along the same priorities as the European Green Deal. This boils a bit back to my question where I was talking about the state aid, but this is indeed also about the national rescue plans. They go into a certain direction, and of course they are not necessarily going into the same direction. What can the Commission do to make sure that all those billions are flowing in the same direction? I think that's very important for the relation between the Commission and the member states. Taking your point, we're not working against each other, but I'm sure that you also agreed that there are always sensitivities there. So even in an organism. And then there are a couple of more specific questions. I would like to pick on a couple of those. On the taxonomy question is asked, how will you make sure that the investments follow the taxonomy is one question. And there is a question on the carbon border adjustment. And this is about our international relation. How are you going to make sure that by implementing this unilaterally, that this is not just adding more global tension, which we already have enough if you look outside? So how to prevent a unilateral implementation of a carbon border adjustment without raising tension? I think that's also a question that is popping up in the chat.
All right, let me briefly try and answer all of them. how do we make sure that every country is taken along? That was already the philosophy in the Green Deal itself, and that was also the reason behind the Just Transition Fund as one of the instruments for that. We also have the cohesion funds, obviously, to do that traditionally, but the Just Transition Fund was an add-on for that. And as I explained in my introduction, we didn't just increase the Just Transition Fund, we quadrupled it up to a 40 billion euro fund from a 7.5 billion, exactly to give or to implement this principle of leaving no country behind, because we do acknowledge that moving forward with the Green Deal even faster than we anticipated and having the economy in reverse, we obviously have a bigger challenge here. But obviously the COVID made the whole distributional aspect a bit more dimensional. It traditionally used to be West against East, or West helps East, or how you want to phrase it. And now, obviously, the South got in too because of their being hit by COVID-19 the hardest, and also suffering most of the economic damage, mostly because they are heavily reliant on tourism, which is one of the sectors that is crashed almost to zero in the last few months. So we hope that we filled in the gaps that COVID-19 occurred or made in the plans that we already had. For the taxonomy, this is one of the instruments that was sort of out there for a while, nice to have, good that we work on it, let's study a bit more, and now all of a sudden it gets urgent because exactly because of the other question that you had on how to align each other, how to help each other align our investment plans towards the Green Deal. The taxonomy is obviously a perfect catalog, a perfect instrument, or a compass, so you wish, to make that alignment happen. It's one of the instruments that we have, and the other one is obviously, as I already explained, is the semester. And while there's a lot of cynicism about the semester and its strength, we are committed here in this commission to give it teeth, real teeth, not only on the 3% budget deficit, not only on the 60% debt, that is the traditional instruments that have teeth, but also on the other recommendations that we put out. And just before we put out the recovery package, we had all the country-specific recommendations, and we made a start with aligning the Green Deal in those recommendations, giving specific countries specific hints or suggestions or tasks to speed up renewable energy implementation for the country that I come from, the Netherlands, that lags behind on that pretty dramatically, but also on energy efficiency for others, etc. So this is exactly where we need to improve ourselves day by day in order to get indeed alignment between the 27 member states and the European Commission. Because I agree, we are an organism, but even within organisms, there's a fight, as COVID shows us in the real world of organisms, not metaphorically. And the last question is absolutely correct. This is what we are faced with: the dilemma of, if we are vigilant, if we are more assertive to the outside world, we also we create a huge risk of creating a new trade war of some kind. And obviously you can try to align that with ratio, and you can calculate the CO2 content of a ton of steel, and you can put that, and you can adapt the carbon border adjustment to that, and you can explain that to the other country, working with an Excel sheet, so to speak. But we also know that the brain of Trump doesn't fit into an Excel sheet, and he can do whatever he thinks he can do sometimes. So yes, we create an extra risk. We throw another match into the explosives that are already out there, and we need to be aware of that. There's no better answer to this. If I had the magic formula, I would immediately apply it, but we don't have that. It's a mix, it's a fragile balance between diplomacy, but also determination of making this work.
Thanks a lot, Diederik. In the chat, there are, of course, also a couple of questions about communication. What Sandrine was also making the point, right? How to make sure that the people are coming along and that they feel part of this project, and that is certainly also a challenge. But can I just throw the question to you, Sandrine, on what you think on how we should improve on that? Because otherwise, it's as always all the questions go to the Commission. But I think this is also something that we need to together is to make sure that, because it is true that for the time being, it's not that 100% of the European society is standing applauding by putting the Green Deal central. There are question marks, people resisting it. So I think the communication certainly should be improved as well. And that's something that the Commission can do, that the Parliament can do, but probably more than that. And well, Club of Rome is also instrumental to that. So I would like to throw the question also a bit back to you, Sandrine.
Thank you, Bas. I really appreciate that question, actually, because I think it is a challenge. And as you know, even though I have an American accent, I firmly am European. And for me, that's fundamental. But I think part of the loss that we've had through the whole Brexit negotiations, everything else, is that people have forgotten what European actually means. Those of us who have lived abroad know, because half the people in the US don't even know where Belgium is, by the way, and I'm a Belgian citizen. But I bring that up because of one key point, and that is that there will have to be different levels of communication. There's the Climate Pact, and I think that's going in the right direction. But having traveled with Connie Hedegaard when she actually was commissioner, and after the climate package, she had decided to travel around in some of the Central and Eastern European member states and other member states and try to pass on the message, the good message of climate. And although I think that there were some fabulous exchanges there, it was not big enough and it wasn't bold enough. There are enough unbelievable communication firms, but also enough knowledge in the European Commission to think through what is the best way to communicate. Part of this has to be like a major election campaign. We have to bring back the positives of what it is to be a European citizen. Actually, countries did this. Ireland did it during the referendum, and they did a brilliant job. They showed exactly where the money was coming into the Irish economy when actually they needed to vote as to whether they should stay in the European Commission. And it worked. We need to do the same as a collective, not just from the European Commission, but also as a series of organizations. And if we're going to focus directly on the Green Deal, one thing I would do, and Diederik knows that our first response to the Green Deal thinking from the Club of Rome was that, first of all, we shouldn't have called it a Green Deal. We should have called it actually a deal for Europeans, because it has a huge social undercurrent, and that the green aspect, sorry, Bas, as much as I love you in the green group, could have been politically hijacked. So I think it's really important that we bring back the fact that this recovery is very much anchored in a deal for Europeans, akin to the Grand Marshall Plan that we had actually prior to the beginning of the coal and steel community. And that we do that also in a very powerful way through a series of citizen assemblies, which, by the way, a series of NGOs are already ready to actually work with the Commission on. My advisory board meetings with Climate Kick, we've been talking about how could we actually have a series of demonstration days where we show all of the incredible things that Europe can do at a community level in terms of shovel-ready projects, etc. So I think we need to do this at different levels. I think we need to work together to make the Climate Pact more than what it is for the moment, which is just a series of potential agreements and coalitions and communication tools. And we really create a massive campaign, which is bottom up and top down.
Thanks a lot. Ursa, you anything on this topic still?
My addition would be that I think also on the question of the communication between the Commission and the member states on whether the national plans are up to the standard. I think there is untapped potential in mobilizing the science community, the think tank community, in doing like shadow or parallel evaluations of these national plans, speaking with a separate voice and giving us this more sort of joined up picture of how it's going. I know that this is working actually quite efficiently in the UNFCCC context, where you have groups like Climate Action Tracker that gives you that sort of very distills the commitments, the plans, the promises in a very effective way. So that would be really interesting to see how the science, the think tank community can step up to the challenge and also speak with a independent, separate voice.
Thanks a lot. Looking at the time, it's 5 o'clock. I think I would like to give Diederik the last word now. Also a bit reacting on this point of communication, how to make sure that the Green Deal, because those questions keep on coming back a bit on how to make sure that this is really a project of the Europeans and not only of the institutions. I'm not saying it is, but how to improve on that. And Climate Pact is a kind of a starting point, as Sandrine already said, but what ideas further? And still also in the chat, some questions every time a bit about how to make sure that the policies you're putting in place, that they also have the impact to the outside world. And there's also, of course, the ideas of, are there proposals coming around due diligence, for example, that you make companies responsible throughout the entire production chain? Maybe that's also something just concretely, Diederik, to answer to, because those questions keep on coming back. And then after Diederik, Gregor, you have the honor to round it off. So Diederik first, and then Gregor.
Very briefly on that specific question on due diligence and etc. That's part of the work that we do in the context of InvestEU, when we really want to put money into companies, even take a stake in companies sometimes, which would be a novelty. The European Commission is not going to do that, but via the national promotional banks that can happen. And obviously part of that will be due diligence. If you take a stake in a company, you are a shareholder, and shareholders do that for a living. And now we have a specific public purpose with it. Just it's not about dividends and making money. It's about a healthy company and a sustainable future. But obviously we have to learn a lot there, and sometimes we can learn from the private business community, and I'm eager to do that if needed for the better of every one of us. On communication, well, having tried to bring across the environmental message for 3 decades now in my life, I have to just admit that there's no formula for that. We tried with being Greenpeace in many ways, a positive, a negative, a dramatic message. It all worked fine, but not exactly, to be honest. And then we were surprised by a movie made by Al Gore, putting some pictures on a screen, Dolby Surround behind it, and all of a sudden the world was mesmerized. It had a short half-life though, so it was gone. And to be honest, to give that example of let's say serendipity, sometimes things happen and change the world. I'm now much more optimistic than after that movie, because there's something new happening now in Europe, and that's our kids. It's the youth of Europe at the moment, and it's from west to east, it's from north to south. If you speak to a kid in Katowice, the mining region in Poland, it's the same message than somewhere in Amsterdam in the hip hop and happening spheres of the centers there. It's the new generation that determines this message, and they are pretty powerful, much more powerful than we are actually, with our leaflets and our thought through messages of communication. They own the kitchen table. They sit at the kitchen table and they talk to their parents, and sometimes their parents are a politician or a CEO of a big company, and then those questions become pretty pertinent. If you, as a father, get the question, what actually are you doing to help to bring about a better future? And that's a pretty confrontational question. And what I've seen in the last few months, or actually almost a year right now, is making me very optimistic. And I dare to say that the only reason that the Green Deal is on the table and that it is part of the European recovery package is because of them. So I'm not resting assured that that will happen itself. We need to be, we need to work on and work hard and try new communication messages. But at the moment, it's going well, not because of us, but because of somebody out there or a group out there. Starting off with a little girl somewhere with a carton sheet in front of a school in Sweden. As I said, serendipity. Sometimes things happen for the better this time. So to end on that high note, I'm optimistic that we can get this done if we stay focused, if we stay vigilant, if we don't get complacent about the beautiful plans that we have, and if we do realize that the real work started a few months ago and will continue for the next 5 years at least.
Yes, I got the honor to close with this. Speaking of serendipity, it took me 3 months to realize that the person who was sitting at the bridge that I passed every day going to work was Greta. So sometimes we can't even see forest for all the trees. Thank you so much to all the speakers and to panelists and to Bas for moderating this, I hope, very interesting webinar. We talk about global leadership and that the EU has to take that leadership given its own environmental impact. I did note Diederik mentioning that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a necessary tool for the EU to raise its own funds, but it could also be a match that is thrown into a tinderbox of global politics at the moment. We did talk about the process of aligning the green recovery or the recovery plans at national level with the Green Deal. Shout out to those of you in the chat who are in Germany, where this is happening at the moment right now, and it can definitely happen that what Germany does is not at all aligned with the Green Deal. We talked a lot about eventually about democracy and the need to build ownership, and somebody in here mentioned the example of Ireland, who's done a very good job in giving people a sense of ownership of the European Union, and then the idea of citizen councils that is, as far as I already piloted in France, for example. What we haven't discussed, and maybe this is something for the next webinar, is the question of how we're going to pay for all of this, and what the aspect of intergenerational justice there in raising all that debt to finance us out of Corona. With these words, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.